this DiCE webinar. My name is Nicoletta Pirozzi. I'm the head of the European Union Programme and Institutional Relations Manager at the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. Today I'm going to talk about differentiation and its impact on the future of the European Union. There is one main point I would like you to take with you after this webinar, and it is that differentiated integration can really be a way forward for the European Union, but its effectiveness, its compatibility with the overall governance of the European Union and its democratic legitimacy need to be preserved. The European Union has experienced three of the biggest challenges in its history since 2008-2010 with the economic and financial crisis. Then in 2015-2016 we experienced an unprecedented influx of migrants from the central and eastern Mediterranean routes, and more recently the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused 500,000 and counting deaths in the European Union, and also a contraction of the GDP of 6.4% in 2020. This pandemic has exacerbated the fragmentation tendency which was already visible within the European Union. And in fact, if we look at the first reactions by member states in the aftermath of the outbreak of the crisis, we realized that some nationalistic choices have been made. Some member states have decided to close borders unilaterally. Some other member states have decided to block the export of medical equipment to other member states. This picture gives us an uncertain outlook for the future of the European Union and raises some fundamental questions for the integration process. First of all, to what extent it is possible to accommodate the growing differentiation and fragmentation within the European Union, and at the same time to preserve the resilience of the integration process. What are the prospects for integration in light of recent crises, and what are the reforms that are needed to ensure an effective response to future crises? We know that differentiation has been always in the DNA of the European Union. We have form of enhanced cooperation among member states, some possibility of opting out from European policies, and also a transition period is granted to new member states of the EU. At the same time, we experience also some projects of differentiated integration within the European Union. We can mention the Eurozone, for example, but also the Schengen area, and more recently the permanent structured cooperation in the field of defense. However, if we look at the outcome of these differentiated integration projects, we realize that there are still some gaps to be filled, and that sometimes this extreme differentiation can carry the risk of disintegration within the European Union. We had a similar fear for Brexit, where we managed to avoid the domino effect, even if the impact in the longer term of the Brexit process still needs to be assessed. And we cannot exclude that some member states will decide to choose the British option of cherry picking in the future. Moreover, it must be said that Brexit is just the tip of the iceberg, and there are other centrifugal forces at stake in many areas of integration, leading also to extreme fragmentation among member states. Therefore, it is necessary to reflect on the pros and cons of differentiated integration and differentiation in the face of mounting political tensions, lack of democratic control, and also potential disintegration. To ensure that differentiated integration is effective, compatible with the governance of the EU, but also legitimate from a democratic point of view, a number of reforms should be introduced. First of all, we have to ensure that the general objective of maintaining the unity of the Union at 27 is preserved. Moreover, the single differentiated integration projects need to have clear defined objectives for the participating member states. This is something that needs to be addressed also in the current differentiated integration projects, such as the Eurozone and the permanent structured cooperation. For example, in the Eurozone, common fiscal policy and risk sharing on TEPSA are still controversial objectives, while in the permanent structured cooperation, the final objective of this cooperation among member states still needs to be defined. The second aspect is the one concerning the risk of free riding. It is very important to clarify for each differentiated integration project which are the commitments undertaken by member states and to introduce a sanctioning mechanism to ensure that these commitments are respected. This is very important because it has to be clear that participation to differentiated integration projects comes with responsibility. In this scenario of increased complexity and differentiation, it is also important to ensure that each differentiated integration project has a clear institutional anchor to the general governance of the European Union. Therefore, for example, in the field of defense, the role of the High Representative should be enhanced, while in the field of the Eurozone, we should seriously consider the creation of the post of Ministry of the Treasury for the future. Overall, it is important to implement some crucial reform in the general governance of the European Union. One reform has to do with the reinforcement of the community method and community part of the European Union instead of the intergovernmental part. The crises that we have faced recently have reinforced the role of intergovernmental bodies such as the European Council and the Council on the European Union, while other institutions, including the Commission and the Parliament, have remained secondary or have played the role of institutions of last resort, as in the case of the Recovery Fund, for example, and also the vaccine strategy. It is time to reinforce the community method by creating a more linear relationship between the legislative and the executive, and also to have some reforms in terms of European elections, which can be the institutionalization of the Spitzenkandidat, the creation of transnational list for European elections, and so on and so forth. At the same time, we have to reduce the field of application of unanimity and consensus and try to expand the role of qualified majority voting in different politics, including also the common security and defense policy. Finally, democratic legitimacy is the biggest challenge for a complex system of integration. and also brings with it greater complexity that makes citizens' participation in the democratic process and accountability very difficult. It is important to create a common space for a European demos, and also to ensure that European citizens are consulted on the main choices for the future of the European Union. That's why the Conference on the Future of Europe is a very important mechanism that needs to be put in place in order to listen to citizens' needs and preferences for the future of Europe. But this needs to be transformed in a real constituent phase, which could lead also to a reform of the treaties, a reform of the competencies of the European Union, a reform of its institutions, and sometimes of its policies. In many fields, from economic governance to migration to security and defense policy. So, to sum up, the impact of recent crises has put the resilience of the European project at risk, accelerating the centrifugal forces already present at political and social level. In such a heterogeneous context, it is important to ensure a certain degree of differentiated integration. However, this needs to be effective, sustainable, and also democratically legitimate. Therefore, it would be very important to implement the reforms mentioned and lay out the foundation for a relaunch of the European project in line with the expectation of citizens and its global ambitions. Thank you. And stay tuned for the next edition of the DiCE webinars.